Thank you, lad. Well, how's your Lent going? Okay, I hope. Have you started any kind of penance or charity or anything yet? There's still lots of time, so don't worry. Try to pick something. And if you want suggestions, we have several for you. And number one is to take a bag from the gathering area. We're collecting toiletry items for the homeless, one of the homeless shelters in Milwaukee. Or take an envelope because we're collecting money to build latrines in our sister parish in the Dominican Republic. The Archbishop was just there this past winter, and he found that so much of their water is polluted because they don't have sanitary facilities. They need latrines, not bathrooms, just latrines. But a latrine will cost $300, so I'm hoping we can build several latrines for them, and we're going to send that money to the Archbishop, as well as Catholic Relief Services. That's the Operation Rice Bowl. That's for charity all throughout the world. So that's almsgiving, that Jesus said we should help the poor, help the stranger, help the lost and forgotten in whatever ways we can. And the gospel for today, in fact, all the readings for today are picked because of their references to water. Water is big in Lent, and of course water was a big reference in the Bible because water was always a metaphor for the life of God. And so it becomes a metaphor also for baptism because the water that Jesus gives, this life-giving water that he was talking about, swelling up to eternal salvation, that's the grace of God that comes to us with the death of Jesus on the cross. The grace of God is like living water come to us, and it's the waters of baptism. On Easter Sunday, everybody will be asked to stand and raise your right hand, and we have to take our baptismal promises over again. Do you believe in God the Father? Do you believe in his Son? Do you reject the devil? Do you reject all his foolish, empty promises and temptations? So we take our baptismal promises on Easter, then we're sprinkled with living water, the water of baptism, because it's by our baptism that we're united to Jesus Christ. By our faith and baptism, that's why we will inherit everlasting life. And the gospel story for today is so great because when we come to church, we come because we want to follow Jesus. We want to get to know Jesus, and we want to be disciples of Jesus Christ, who's Savior of the world. So this wonderful story of the Samaritan woman has a lot to teach us about Jesus and then about us. Because disciples should be like the Master. We want to be like Jesus. So here's 4 things that you can kind of quiz yourself on to see if you're like the Master, Jesus Christ. And the first is this, that Jesus did not practice any kind of racism. He did not. When he came to the Samaritan woman, she was a different race. They were Samaritans, and there was some history involved there. And there was interbreeding over the intermarriage and interbreeding, cousins with cousins, etc., brothers with sisters, etc. And so there was a physical appearance to a Samaritan that had happened over the generations. So the racial difference between Samaritans and Jews was readily apparent. And good Jews did not associate with Samaritans, except for Jesus. Jesus does, because racial differences don't make any difference to him. You see, he did not have any kind of racial superiority, racial racism in him whatsoever. He goes right up to speak to the woman of another race. And when the disciples come back, you see that they're surprised that Jesus would be doing that. Ask yourself, what about me and race? Do I look down upon brown people? Mexicans are stealing our jobs and they don't pay taxes, and they're taking jobs away from good Americans, and they're troublemakers. Is that true? Or is it a little bit of racism that's within us? I'll confess my own racism. It might be against Muslims, especially Muslims on an airplane. Kind of gives me, you need to grow in that area. When I was pastor of St. Veronica in Milwaukee, there was a mosque down the street. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll save that for my next point. So Jesus did not practice racism, and he did not give in to that. He also did not look down upon people because of their religion. their religion. She was a Samaritan, and that was both a race and a religion. Just like if you're Jewish, that is a race, the Jewish race. If you're born of a Hebrew mother, you are Jewish. But it's also a religion. And it was the same for the Samaritans. It was a race, but also a religion. They had their own temple on Mount Gerizim, and they practiced their own faith. And so Jews didn't like that, and so they would not associate with them. The Jewish people were standoffish then, and they ostracized people of another race or religion. Not Jesus. He loved people based on the character of their souls, not on their religious label or the color of their skin. So he did not look down upon Samaritans whatsoever. In fact, one of his most famous parables is called the Good Samaritan. Not the good Jew, the Good Samaritan. That burned the Jews when they heard that parable. But the Good Samaritan, religion, you see, Jesus looks at your life, not at your label. So I was going to tell you, when I was pastor in Milwaukee, we had a mosque that was nearby to us. And you know, I had that prejudice within myself of those of another religion, because you could see the women from the mosque were wearing their hijab. And a woman came barreling down the middle of the street in her car, and literally I had to pull off the road because she wasn't going to move. She was going right down the middle of the street. You know, that brought out a lot of prejudice in me. And we have to guard against that so much. You know, is it because of her Muslim religion that she was driving down the middle of the street? I guess not. She's probably just a bad driver, you know. But we judge people of another religion, you see? And right now, the threat against Muslims is so apparent in our country for today. Keep them out. They're terrorists. Is that fair to say? And what if they did say that 200 years ago about Catholics. Keep them out. The Ku Klux Klan, even in Wisconsin, burned crosses and burned down churches and chapels to keep us out. So now we should have the wisdom not to want to keep anybody out of their true heartfelt religion. Maybe we should learn more about the Muslim faith. Jesus had no prejudice, racial prejudice or religious prejudice. He also didn't have prejudice because of gender. And this has to do with the woman. Jewish men did not speak to any woman in public. Women were property. You see, that's why in the Catholic Church at weddings we do not say, "Who giveth this woman?" Because she's not a piece of property that her father giveth. She giveth herself because she's an independent woman, every bride. And so, women still make, on average, 80% of what men make in salary in the United States. There is a lot of gender prejudice in our country, a lot of sexism in our country still. Do you feel that within yourself, that you do look down on women? They're not quite as bright as the men. You see, they're not quite fit for leader. We almost had a woman president. Do we have that sexism within us? Evidently, Jesus did not, because St. John tells us that the apostles were quite surprised to find that Jesus was speaking publicly to a woman in the middle of the day. He didn't care about the taboos that were there in his day. He broke those taboos, and one of them was men and women and sexism. And then fourth and finally, another taboo that Jesus breaks was the taboo against sinners. Jewish people believe that you should shun sinners. Try to say that. You should shun sinners. You should shun sinners. And Catholics did that too. We did that in the 40s, 50s. You see, we were always taught if somebody's, divorced or gay or you name it, we should shun them and not kick them out of the family. Thanks be to God, we don't believe that. We don't teach that anymore, and we haven't for years. We haven't for years because Jesus never did. This woman was a sinner. How do I know that? Because Jesus tells her she's had 5 husbands. Now, Moses permitted divorce. Jesus didn't, but Moses did. But 5 would be pushing it, To have 4 divorces and actually 5 because now she's got another man. So Jesus knows that she is a sinner, and we know it also because why was she at Jacob's well at noon? Noon was the hottest time of the day. Hebrew women went to the well to get water in the early morning or late in the evening, because that's when it was the coolest. This poor woman has to go at noon because the other women don't want to speak to her, and she's too embarrassed to be seen with the other women. So she's got to go when she knows she won't bump into anybody. She felt so embarrassed and ashamed. But Jesus talks to her about her lifestyle. And Jesus talks to her. I don't see condemnation in his voice. He forgave the woman in adultery. And he speaks lovingly to this woman and begins to explain. She becomes a disciple then because of the way that Jesus spoke with her. Jesus, our companion on the journey. And so also you and I should not have prejudice even against sinners. Because if you had prejudice against sinners, I couldn't be the pastor. You couldn't be a Catholic. We'd have nobody left in our church if we had signs, no sinners allowed. You see? But sinners are allowed in the Catholic Church. The church is for us because Jesus is for us. Do you look down on sinners of whatever it might be? You get to pick your own vice there. And somebody that you look down on, maybe it's somebody at work. And even if you don't approve of their lifestyle, Jesus did not approve of the woman's lifestyle, but he did not see that as a reason to ignore her, to ostracize her, to embarrass her, or humiliate her. He speaks to her as an equal. They have this conversation, and this marvelous transformation takes place. So there are 4 ways then that we can be like Jesus, to follow his life, to follow his beliefs, to follow his teaching. And Lent is the perfect time for us to do so, to draw closer to Christ, our crucified and risen Lord. So take your red hymnals for the Apostles' Creed.